Warning, this content is for entertainment and educational purposes only. This video is brought to you by First Detachment Nutrition. Battle tested, expert formulated. Use discount code AB10 at checkout for 10% off. All right, folks, Big Paul here today with Kurt Havens. We're going to not talk about steroids today for a change, Kurt. We're going to talk about the science of carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are something that people get very emotional about. And hopefully we can pull back the curtain and show people that carbohydrates are not the enemy, that they're actually your friend if you're a bodybuilder, and they are going to improve your performance in the gym. We're going to kind of take a high-level look at what the various forms of carbohydrates are, how your body metabolizes them, and what role they play in performance in the gym. And we'll sort of dig into all that and hopefully demystify it a little bit and show you why it makes sense to eat carbohydrates if you want to be the best bodybuilder you can possibly be. What's going on, Kurt?
Nothing, man. Yeah, this is kind of like an ongoing hard topic, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's a constant debate that I am having with guys on social media that they all think the carbs are the enemy. I mean, there are certain situations. I always have looked at diet as a tool. It's a tool in your tool belt. And there are various tools for various jobs, and you want to choose the appropriate tool for the appropriate job. So like if you have somebody that has severe metabolic disorder, insulin resistant, obese, you probably want to be sparing with carbohydrates.
At least mindful of
right.
That, right? But I think most of what we'll talk about is probably with bodybuilders,
correct,
athletes, or weekend warriors, whatever, guys in the gym that are trying to look better.
Yeah. So and we're going to focus on that aspect of it. So if you're a dude that wants to perform your best in the gym, look your best, maybe you're an amateur bodybuilder, maybe you're a power lifter, maybe you're just a gym bro that wants to look good at the club on the weekend, or I went to my class reunion yesterday, class reunion. Carbohydrates are your friend. So let's start from the top down. Well, I'm going to share my screen here. We'll talk about I think it's important to sort of look at carbs at a high level and understand what the various types of carbs are. What they are. At a high level, carbohydrates are just a sugar, correct?
Yep.
Just a collection sugar or a collection of sugar molecules.
Yeah, and I think to even be more basic, right? I think one of the arguments is that people will say, well, carbohydrates are not a required thing for the human body, right? There's no such thing as required carbohydrate in the human body.
Right.
That being said, glucose is required for the human body. So if we don't give ourselves carbohydrates through our diet, your body will make glucose, right? Primarily through breaking down protein.
Right.
Making it from fat is a very tedious and long process. So it's generally not that efficient, especially during exercise. You're not going to cleave a glycerol off of a triglyceride to make glucose while you're lifting weights. It's not really going to happen.
No, it's not. It's not a ready, accessible fuel source that's going to get you through your workout. So it's this. At the end of the day, I tell people it's a survival mechanism.
Yep.
So literally, when you eat a keto or carnivore diet, it's basically your body will make what it needs, but it's like the bare minimum for survival. It's not going to be optimal for performance in the gym.
I was just going to say, so you need roughly, the average person needs like 140 grams of glucose a day just for their nervous system to function. So you got to figure you're already starting out in a hole if you're eating less than that. Yeah,
and anybody that's run low carbs at the end of contest prep to get that extra bit of fat off, they know what it feels like when you dip below. Usually I found when I get below 150 grams of carbs, that's when your brain stops working.
And it's the first thing you notice is the brain fog.
Yeah, it's the brain fog. That's the first symptom. And your brain literally runs on glucose.
Yeah, and it cannot, so kind of an interesting fact. So it can run on glucose, right? And it can run on ketones as a backup, but it cannot run on dietary fat. And the reason why is because the brain is 60% fat. So if the brain could actually run on fat, it would metabolize itself.
It would eat itself, correct.
It literally would eat itself. So the brain cannot function on dietary fat.
Yeah, and I think a thing that Like, guys don't understand. They talk about how you don't need carbohydrates, but it's that your body is making what it needs just to keep going. And if that were true, that you didn't need carbohydrates, type 1 diabetics wouldn't die. You literally, they used to call, I believe, type 1 diabetes before they understood what it was. It was called wasting disease or wasting disorder. And type 1 diabetics could eat all the food they want, and they would literally waste away, starve until
fall into a coma.
Yeah, you'd fall into a coma and die because your body couldn't utilize any carbohydrates.
They used to put them in rooms in hospitals together, before the 1920s, and they would just die.
It's a pretty horrible way to die, too. All right, Gym Bros, I'm going to interrupt this regularly scheduled broadcast to tell you about the new Science of HGH ebook by Kurt Havens. It is available on the Anabolic Bodybuilding website for download right now. There is a link in the video description below for the ebook if you want to pick it up. It is probably the most comprehensive ebook about performance enhancement use with HGH, over 100 pages of information with references, and it's awesome. Go check it out. All right, so let's take a look at from top down what carbohydrates are. We have basically, we have two categories here. We have simple and complex. And simple, we have your single and then dual sugar bonds here, and complex are many sugar. So we have the monosaccharides, which is a single sugar, which we have glucose, fructose, galactose. And then in disaccharides, we have maltose, sucrose, lactose. And then in complex, we have starch, glycogen, and fiber. At a high level, glucose is the most abundant carbohydrate in the body. Glycogenesis, in which the liver converts glucose into glycogen for storage. So glucose is readily converted to glycogen in the body. So glucose is probably the best thing for us for glycogen storage.
And it's a one-way. So in muscles, at least, it's a one-way pathway. So it's synthesized, but it can't be released unless there's exercise. Like, you can only use the glycogen in your liver for your blood sugar. So you don't pull glucose out of your muscles to run your body on.
Yeah, typically, yeah, unless you're completely depleting the end of contest, then that rule may.
Yeah, but with no exercise, without stimulation.
Yeah, it's so the whole thing, like where people don't, I think for most of these keto and carnivore diets, why they work for most people is because most people are sedentary. They're not actually using any glycogen. And
people want really immediate stuff, right? We live in a country where everything's instant. So when you first drop your carbohydrates really low, the first thing you're going to do is lose water. So these guys or girls will get on the scale and will be 10 pounds lighter in a week because they lost glycogen. And that little pure thinner, right? Because it makes you look thinner when you're depleted.
Yep.
And for the average person that doesn't look fantastic to begin with, that initial weight drop makes them look initially better, right? So then they stick with this.
Yep. Yeah, and that's another point too. I try to make people, like, with the rapid weight loss or weight gain, you can do the math on it. You can do the math on it. A pound of fat is roughly 3,500 calories. So we talk about that 10-pound weight loss. So if you were to metabolize 10 pounds worth of fat, that is 35,000 calories of fat in a week. So that would be 5,000 calories a day. You are not metabolizing 5,000 calories of fat in a day.
No, that's in a vacuum too, right? Because you're not just going to metabolize fat.
Right.
The body doesn't want to do just that.
Right. So that whole, when I hear people say, well, I lost 10 pounds in a week or 2 weeks, you didn't lose 10 pounds of fat in 2 weeks. Yep. Literally, a lot of times I've seen people where their body fat percentage will go up.
Yep.
Yeah.
They're just losing muscle glycogen, and they're not actually losing any fat. And what really determines, like, to keep it like on a really understandable level, what determines, people will say, well, what determines if it's going to be muscle loss or fat loss, typically, in a really simple way, is really a function of diet and exercise. So if you just cut your calories to a point that you'd be in a deficit to lose body weight, but you don't exercise and your protein is below the minimum threshold, most of the weight is going to come off as muscle, right? So in order to shift it to mostly fat loss, your protein has to be high I mean, there's some things that just are non-negotiable. So the protein has to be high. And by high, I mean, 0.8 grams per pound. It's not 500 grams of protein a day. And you have to strength train because the body needs to see a reason to keep that muscle tissue. If it sees no reason, it's not going to keep protein synthesis elevated, and protein breakdown will increase. And it's much easier for your body to take amino acids like alanine out of the muscles to make glucose. It's a really efficient process. And once alanine's pulled out, the muscles waste away.
Yeah, I hear a lot of the carnivore guys, they make the argument for gluconeogenesis that your body is going to make all of the glucose that it needs.
It will, but it's not efficient, right? And you'd have to eat thousands of grams of protein in order to sustain that, which means you're not getting any protein toward muscle protein synthesis at all.
Right.
So you're wasting it all. And
I don't think people understand that gluconeogenesis is literally a catabolic process.
Yes. Right. Yeah. I mean, that's at the most simple level. That's really all it is.
And we want to prevent catabolism when we're trying to grow muscle.
Ideally. I think that anyone listening to this, their goal probably is to look better, right? And if you're losing muscle and not necessarily losing any fat, you're probably not going to look any better.
Yeah, we can do the math too on the glycogen depletion too. So, I mean, we talked about it briefly before, but it's it's somewhere between 3 to 4 parts water per gram of
just over 3.
Glucose. So I mean, let's just assume 3. So if you have 1,000 grams of stored glycogen and you lose that 1,000 grams of stored glycogen, you're going to lose 3,000 grams of water along with it too. So you have 4 kilograms, which is 8.8 pounds if my math is correct here. So there's your 9-pound weight loss that you had in a week. You may have lost a pound of fat, but you probably lost 9 pounds of glycogen with it as well.
And again, not to get too complicated, but a hydrated muscle, meaning a muscle that's full of glycogen because it has water. Carbohydrate, the reason why the end part is hydrated is because of the water content. Hydrated muscle that's full of glycogen is an anabolic muscle, right? And a muscle that's depleted of glycogen is not an anabolic muscle for multiple reasons, but it's as simple as that. You don't want to be flat and try to grow.
Right. Yeah. Right? So I mean, it's just the whole process of that. It's just really nonsensical that people think that is an efficient way to do things. And then, you toss in gluconeogenesis on top of it. So your glycogen depleted. To be truly in ketosis too, people that run keto diets, your protein has to be pretty low.
Relatively low, yeah. Most people that do keto are not actually keto.
No, they're not doing keto. They just call it's keto by name only. They're really, I guess, really it would be more of a carnivore style of diet.
If the body, so if we use like 160 grams of glucose as an example, so like we're talking about like maintaining the body at a minimum amount of glucose. So the body will convert amino acids to glucose at a 30% efficiency rate. So the body's pretty good at breaking protein down to make glucose out of it. And if you needed to just run on a bare minimum of 160 grams of carbs and glucose a day, and you ate no carbs, you'd have to consume 530 grams of protein a day just to make the 160 grams of glucose. So then try to grow muscle when you're already eating 530 grams of protein just to cover your glucose needs.
Yep.
It doesn't make any sense. So you need 1,000 grams of protein a day just because you're refused to eat rice.
Yeah, it's literally you're just eating really. This is what I tell people all the time. You're just eating very expensive, hard to digest carbohydrates.
And you're basically, again, really simplified terms, you're basically training your liver to become very efficient at running on protein.
Right.
And the energy yield from that is atrocious. Like I said, it's only 30%, so it's not this very efficient process. So your body's not going to feel good doing that.
Something I've wondered about too is if it doesn't actually tax and put more stress on the liver too.
Well, you'll see markers will go up, right? The ALT,
yep.
And things will go up because the liver's now working harder, right?
You'll hear people talk about how high protein. It was the thing in the past. I heard how people say high protein diets were bad for the liver. I don't think it was the actual high protein diet. I think it's probably gluconeogenesis potentially putting stress on. I'm just speculating here.
Yeah, well, it also same with kidneys, right? So I think where a lot of the misconception is people see things working harder. It doesn't mean that working harder equals stress, right? When you go for a run, your lungs and your heart have to work harder. It doesn't mean your lungs are under stress. That's an organ can work harder without destroying itself.
All right, so let's move on to fructose. This is another one I think guys get themselves twisted up into knots. I've had multiple people reach out to me talking about, the coach said don't eat fruit, because fructose is not going to get stored as glycogen. Fructose is a ketonic simple sugar found mostly in fruits. And honestly, when you take a look at fruits, it's a very small amount of fructose that's actually in
30 to 50.
It's not even that. Like I looked at like a banana, like 20 out of the, at 25 grams of carbs from banana, it was like 6 of it's actually fructose.
Yeah, and I mean the estimates are all over the place, but you'd probably have to consume between 100 and 200 grams of pure fructose in order for it to create fat in the liver. Like your liver has a great capacity for this stuff. But I make a bold statement and say that no one's ever gotten fat from eating fruit.
Yeah, I mean anything's possible, but this is another one where I go back to Roman Fritz as an example. He talked about when he was in boarding school, he famously talked about his apple diet where I think he was eating 100 apples a day because it was the only carbs that he could get a hold of, and he didn't get fat. But the liver, from what I understand, the liver on average can store up to about 100 grams of glycogen. You'd have to eat a shit ton of fruit. So if we think about that. Medium banana has about 25 grams of carbs, if my math is correct. And 6 of that is 6 or 7, something like that, is actual fructose. You'd have to eat like 20 bananas.
You'd have a very upset stomach before you'd ever get fat.
Yeah, upset stomach, and you probably would be hyperkalemic as well from eating that many bananas.
Well, so the point of filling the liver with glycogen too is to maintain your blood sugar.
From what I understand, and I've heard this speculated before, that because the liver glycogen is the emergency store for basically keeping you alive, that your body's going to prioritize liver glycogen over muscle glycogen first.
Yeah, of course. I mean, the body doesn't view, regardless of what you and I think, the body doesn't view muscle as very important. So it's going to prioritize organs first.
So I remember Dr. Todd talking about this, like he would have some fructose in the diets he would put together in the past, so you would occupy the liver so you could free up other glucose to be stored as muscle glycogen.
It's a common, I don't know how you do it, but a common way to carb back up is to fill liver up first, right? So when you first reintroduce carbs, you could introduce some fruit first or some honey.
Yeah, I'll do bananas and orange juice.
And then move on to muscle.
Yep, I'll do bananas and orange juice for that portion of it. But roughly 1/3 to 1/2 of fructose is converted into liver glycogen, according to the studies I found, and 20% of it. I'm sorry, 1/3 to 1/2 is converted by the liver to glucose. 20 to 30% is converted into glycogen, and 20 to 30% is converted into lactate. So,
and lactate can then be run back around through a different cycle and basically turn back to glucose again.
Right. So like the fear of fructose being converted into liver glycogen or liver fat is pretty low. I don't think you have to worry about that. Now, high fructose corn syrup might be another.
It could. The data's kind of iffy on it. It's really such a small change from regular fructose.
Yeah, and I told you, I looked, literally, it was on Pfizer's website. They had a study up on fructose and high fructose corn syrup metabolism, and they literally don't know. They said that in the study. They have ideas on how it's metabolized, but they're not 100% sure.
No, with most of this stuff, no one is 100% sure, right? But we've had a pretty good idea for a long time. The one thing that high fructose corn syrup seems to do, which is one of the reasons why it was most likely invented, is leptin doesn't recognize it. So
right.
And fructose in general. So when you change the ratio to make it more fructose, the brain doesn't really recognize it as a nutrient. So you will continue to be hungry. It's one of the reasons why when you're dieting, you don't necessarily want to rely heavily on fruit, right?
And that's probably more likely the reason why you get fat, because you have no leptin signaling. Yep. Right. And you just keep pounding it. We can pretty much eliminate the worry about fructose. You need some, and it probably is going to be good for liver glycogen storage.
And the other health benefits of eating fruit.
Right.
I mean,
Micronutrients
are pretty much inversely correlated to every disease known.
All right. Next one is galactose, which is another monosaccharide, which is a milk sugar, which is part of lactose, correct? If I recall correctly. All right, so next down on the other simple sugars, we're going down to the disaccharides, which is 2 sugar molecules. It's 2 units of sugar combined. So we have maltose, which is 2 units of glucose combined. It's broken down into glucose in the small intestine by the maltase enzyme. That's why sometimes people get gassy from things that have stuff like that, right?
Yep.
Sucrose is a bonded fructose and glucose molecule that gets split apart.
And known as table sugar, mostly.
Known as table sugar. Yeah, it's just plain old table sugar. And it's the sweet tasting sugar. And then lactose, which is the glucose and galactose combined. Gal is what they go by. And it's broken down in the small intestine into glucose and galactose by the lactase enzyme. A lot of people as we age are deficient in. So people who like to eat a ton of dairy, this is why dairy causes problems. That stuff just sits in your intestine and rots. That's why you get gassy, because your body's literally doing nothing with it. It's just rotting in your intestine.
Yep.
Probably not the best choice of carbohydrate source.
No, I generally don't include a ton of milk.
Polysaccharides, complex, which are many sugars bonded together. Starch, which is many glucose units joined together. It's metabolized into glucose. A bodybuilding example would be rice.
Yep. And starch is similar to glycogen in structure.
They're usually plant. I think they're all plant-based, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, all starches are plant-based. Glycogen, which is multi-branch glucose stored for later use, and we talked about that a little bit earlier. We talked about the weight loss from it. And then fiber, which is a carbohydrate polysaccharide that cannot be completely broken down in the digestive process, and we have soluble and insoluble fibers.
It's really the only nutrient that the human body doesn't fully absorb, right? I think a lot of people are confused about the term absorption. I think it's misused. The lack of absorption is diarrhea. So if someone says, well, you can't eat this much protein because you won't absorb it, it's a myth. And also the easiest way to tell us if you're absorbing something is you'd have diarrhea.
Right.
It doesn't occur. So fiber is really the only thing that, depending on the type of fiber, a percentage of it is just passed through, but everything else that you put in your body is put to use somewhere.
A simple way to think of fiber, when you see these people that say net carbs on their advertising for their health foods, carbs, they literally, the fiber is not really, most of the fiber is not making it into the bloodstream as glucose. So when you see 10 net grams of carbs and there's actually 25 on the thing, they're netting out the fiber from it. So I don't really count fiber in my carbohydrate intake. It's also for bodybuilding purposes. Like I hear a lot of guys talk about, I've had some dudes that they like to eat their brown rice in the off season. I'm like, really poor choice. You can get your fiber from elsewhere, but if you actually want to do something with that
rice, when it blocks some mineral absorption too, by eating brown rice.
Right, it's going to really affect your performance, and you're not really getting much of the starch actually into your body from it. It's great for fat loss because it'll make you feel full, right? But you're not getting much out of it in the off season. So brown rice is a really, really poor choice for your off-season carbohydrate sources, your starchy carbohydrate sources.
Yeah, right. When you diet, you tend to eat more fiber because it keeps you full longer.
Right. We want to increase food volume. One of my hacks for dieting, as I go in, and I posted a picture up the other day, and I think it blew people's heads open, is looking for higher weight foods that have lower caloric density. So swapping out oats for something like some rice or something in a meal, or using a potato that's going to weigh more than the rice per gram, so it keeps you feeling satiated. So your food volume is essentially the same as you were before, but you're swapping it out for lower calorie foods. So just a sort of a bodybuilding hack there. And you can do it a lot with carbohydrates. Yeah.
There was a list published, I can send you a link, of the 10 most satiating foods. And it's interesting because there was nothing that was really heavy in dietary fat on that list.
Yep.
The number one satiating food was a white potato.
Was potatoes, yep. I saw that same list.
That, the carnivore guys will think that that's false, but it's actually the opposite.
Yeah, I mean, a large baked potato has something like 200 calories in it. It's the fat that people put on the potato, the bacon, the cheese, the sour cream, the butter. That's where you get in trouble. But try eating a whole baked potato, 200 calories worth of a baked potato, and let me know how you feel. Or try to get 1,000 grams of carbs from baked potatoes.
Yeah, it's a lot.
I would challenge you to do that. You're not going to go very far. So let's talk about fat storage and carbohydrates. This is another area where people get themselves really twisted up into knots and just like assume that carbs make you fat.
Okay, so carbohydrates directly don't really get stored as fat, right? And again, I think the average American misunderstands what a carbohydrate is. They're what we just discussed. Things like pizza, it's not a carbohydrate, right? There's more calories in pizza from fat than there is from the carbs. We'll say, less than 2% of carbs will get directly stored in adipose tissue outside of metabolic, syndrome. So
that is the one caveat. I want to tell people that. I want to stop there for a second. So if you are insulin resistant, if you're in some sort of, you have some sort of metabolic disorder, if you're severely obese, then a lot of times you'll see it where people will just start spewing out triglycerides from eating carbohydrates. But that's not normal. You are in a diseased state. You're sick.
Yeah. So de novo lipogenesis is the creation of a triglyceride from another source.
Right.
So in order for the potato or white rice to get stored as fat, it has to circulate. So it'll go to the liver, right? The liver's full. It'll go to your muscles full. Then it has to go back to your liver. Assuming your liver's still full at that point, it would then get turned into triglyceride. And then it will enter circulation. And then if you're in a calorie deficit, then it gets stored. If someone is not in a calorie excess, nothing can get stored.
Right.
That's physics. So if you're in a calorie deficit, it doesn't matter what it is. Your body does not store glycogen or fat in a calorie deficit.
Right.
So
it's a moot point.
You're not only in an excess can you store. That's physics.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's thermodynamics. I know people like to argue the whole thermodynamics thing doesn't apply to the human body, but the human body, from what I understand, is an open thermodynamic system. Think of it, I think the simple way to explain, like people don't understand the difference between an open and a closed thermodynamic systems. A closed thermodynamic system would be the pot of water with the lid on it when you're boiling it, right? None of that water is escaping from the system, where it's all the moisture is collected back into the pot. Whereas an open thermodynamic system would be the pot with the lid open. So we exchange heat, right, when we burn calories. Respiration, heat, etc. Right. So, but thermodynamics still applies. You cannot create energy; is only exchanged.
Yep.
It is not destroyed nor created. Anyway, all right. So yeah, I wish I could find this study. There was a study recently, and I saw Lane Norton post it and talk about it, where they actually did. I think it was an isotope. Maybe it wasn't. What's that?
Was it on body fat? What it was made of?
Yeah, what it was made of, and it was well over 90% of it was actually from lipids.
Yep. And this stuff's not new. This is, like I said, they've known this since the 1920s. This is you can buy a medical book from the 1920s, and it specifically talks about the carbohydrate role in the human body and the dietary fat role in the human body, and the role of carbohydrates is immediate energy for glucose and to be stored as glycogen. Not once in there does it mention it being stored as fat.
Right. Yeah. So your body is going to prioritize maintaining, like we talked about, that sort of that 100 to 150 grams of carbohydrates as a baseline for basically cellular and brain function. Correct.
Yeah. And like red blood cells, for instance, can only run on glucose. They don't have the ability to run on ketones. So that's a great example of someone who's in ketosis. The body's still going to destroy some level of muscle just to maintain red blood cells.
Yeah. So you're, once again, when you're in ketosis, another catabolic state. Ketosis is catabolic. Gluconeogenesis is catabolic. Both. You are destroying proteins in gluconeogenesis for glucose.
Yep.
Your body's making glucose from stored proteins a lot of times. And where do we store protein?
In our muscle.
in our muscles, right? Fat is stored as body fat, generally, right? And where do we?
Very small percentage used for immune system and cellular membrane, right? But that's like where essential fatty acids. So
Those are essential fatty acids. Essentially, that's another thing too. We'll talk about. We should probably do one on fats as well. But saturated fats are pretty much only used for energy
and storage energy.
Storage energy. There is some small bit of it, I think, is converted to cholesterol, which is used for hormone production. Right, but the body can make its own cholesterol.
That's what the liver does.
Yep. Yeah. So the guys that are worried about, I get, this is another one. I get people that are illogically worried about hormone production and fat from, being, that's another bro myth that I've seen out there, is that you have to eat a lot of fat to have hormone production.
No, it's very small. The need.
Very small. Very small. And actually the requirements for EFAs is actually really small too. A guy my size, probably I could get by with like 20 or 30 grams a day.
Yeah. And so we should probably do a video on fat, but by definition, the only two fats that are essential are ALA and LA, right?
LA.
Yep. What's in flaxseed. The reason why they're considered essential is because they're the only two fatty acids the human body cannot produce, but they're not actually what the human body is looking for. It wants EPA and DHA, which is what's
EPA and DHA, fish oil.
The problem is those are not considered essential because technically you can produce them from the ALA and the LA, except the conversion rate in humans is 3%. So if you were to just consume flaxseed oil, which would give you technically the essential fatty acids, your conversion rate's only 3%. You're still not going to get the needed amount, right? And that's where our ancestors, when they would eat animals, they were eating grass. So they were able to convert at a much higher rate. So we were getting those fatty acids. Right. In modern diet, there's very few things that supply those. That's why it's wise for most people to supplement with those. And at least me personally, I use fish oil to go right to the end product. And then I backfill with flaxseed oil because
I do the exact same thing.
I'm sure there's a role for those other two fats, even though you're bringing the end product in. The same as I would backfill. Todd and I disagree with this, but I backfill with DHA and pregnenolone, even though I'm giving myself the end substrate of testosterone, because there's still a role of those hormones outside of just producing testosterone.
Yeah, I think Vigorous. I was talking to Vigorous Steve. He does the same thing.
Yeah,
that's something I need to consider. But yeah, so the whole you need fats for hormone production. It's very, very, very. Yeah,
it's very low.
It's very low. It's very low. Like you really don't need a ton.
No, 1 tablespoon of flaxseed oil and 3 to 4 grams of fish oil would be more than enough fat for the human body to run on. And if people question that, if you look at your body, you have plenty of stored fat.
Right. That's the thing I get. Like, I get these guys that are 30% body fat that worry about taking in enough fat for the hormone production. I'm like, dude, you've got about 50 pounds of it on your ass.
Yeah. You don't need to be taking in more of it just to make hormones.
I don't think the average American is deficient in fats.
I've never met anyone deficient in fat outside of someone for a very short time during show prep, maybe.
Yeah, like at the end of contest prep, I've been there before. But I mean, we're talking about 4% body fat where your dietary fat is down to almost 0. You'll know it when you're there too. I've been there before, and you feel fucking awful.
Yeah.
You'll know it. You'll know it. So I don't think very few people actually.
Most people have never experienced that. That's not something
they've never gotten to that point where you're literally in a starvation state at that point. So yeah, people fear the fat. Let's talk about insulin too. This is another one that people get just absolutely themselves twisted up in knots that in carbohydrates are what make you fat.
Right. So the insulin model of obesity was disproven almost 30 years ago. So insulin is it's like a chaperone. It's just moving a substrate, right, to a cell. And insulin in and of itself cannot make someone fat. Insulin doesn't have any calories per se. Insulin itself does not get stored, right? So the primary site where insulin is going to drive nutrients is going to be into the muscle.
Right.
That's where the most abundant receptors like GLUT4 would be located. not so much on fat
Yeah,
cells.
people don't understand that the majority of it's going to be stored in the muscle.
Yep.
Just ask any bodybuilder that's running, eating a bunch of carbs and taking,
Or
taking,
longer, whatever.
taking their, it's just ridiculous that people even think that. But yeah, I mean, insulin can store fat.
Of course, I mean, and if someone has a metabolic disorder, that's a different story. But that's not necessarily what we're talking about.
Right. And I think that a lot of these books, like I've seen, oh God, I can't remember the one doctor, but there's this one doctor talking about the insulin model of obesity or whatever. But it really, his book and like this whole model that he's talking about applies to type 2 diabetics.
Yeah.
And everything's it's just completely disordered.
Yeah. I mean, and I don't know. So in case people don't understand, so type 1 diabetes is caused by an autoimmune disease, and the pancreas doesn't produce adequate insulin to move nutrients.
Right.
Type 2 diabetes is basically, generally 80% of those people are overweight. There could be other causes, but it's generally you've gotten to a point where your cells are basically inflamed and the cell membrane, GLUT4, which is the receptor, or the GLUT receptors, can't translocate to the outside to allow insulin to bring the nutrients in. So then it sits in your blood, but they're opposite.
If you're eating a decent diet and you're training weights, it's pretty much damn near impossible to be type 2.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not saying it can't happen.
You'd have to severely overeat
and take a lot of growth hormone.
Yeah.
Even then, like the whole growth hormone thing, I have not really seen insulin resistance in even guys running tons of growth hormone as long as their diet's clean.
My blood sugar never goes above the highest I've ever seen it is in the 90s, the low 90s.
My blood sugars were running really high, and I discovered that I actually have pancreatic insufficiency.
Okay.
My insulin levels were running really low. Basically, my body doesn't make enough insulin to keep up.
With that too, that's also why. So bodybuilders use insulin typically because it is anabolic at a super physiological dose. At the normal level that we produce, it's anabolic because it helps build tissue, but it's not really doing anything wild.
It's not directly anabolic.
Yeah, and the other reason is because the food required to be 280 pounds. Most people's pancreases are not able to keep up with that load.
Right. No, you can't keep up with that. That's another point too that I've made with guys. If you're slamming a bunch of carbs, that insulin probably could be prophylactic. I think a lot of older bodybuilders, you hear of them becoming diabetics, and I don't know that doctors understand how to properly diagnose them. And they assume that it's type 2 when they're probably they're probably they probably made themselves into type 1 just from wearing out their pancreas from overconsumption of carbohydrates. Although, I mean, it is a feedback loop. The more insulin you produce, the more insulin resistant you become. Yeah. So, which is why we carb cycle.
Yeah, but also because you're going to get someone that's a low carb cell watching this that says, well, there's your proof right there. So by eating carbs, you've not burned your pancreas out. The amount of carbohydrates we're talking about are over 2,000 grams, right? That's doing this. It's not 150 grams of carbs aren't burning the pancreas cell.
Right. Yeah. I mean, you have to be eating thousands. And even then, like I've seen, like, it's not what people think.
No. I mean, I consume 5 days a week. I consume 1,500 grams of carbs and my blood sugar never gets out of control.
Right. Yeah. People just, they don't understand it on a basic level. So we have established that carbohydrates primarily are going to get stored, either used for energy, immediate energy needs, whether it's brain, cellular, etc., stored as excess carbohydrates, get stored as glycogen in both the liver and the muscle. That's another point too. Like a sedentary person is probably not really going to be storing any muscle glycogen because they're not doing anything.
No, the storage is much. It's very reduced versus bodybuilding.
And this is where carb cycling makes a lot of sense for bodybuilders. I'm not saying it is the be all end all diet. Like I tell people,
I would say probably the vast majority of bodybuilders use some form of it, right?
Right. They're doing some sort of caloric cycling. You look at all the top level pros, they're carb loading it, or even on contest prep, they pull carbs down because they need to be in a deficit to burn fat during the week, and then they'll carb load 1 or 2 times a week with a high carbohydrate day. But what we have here And we'll go back to Roman Fritz again, where I had him on the other week, and he talked about his carb load being 2,500 grams of carbs. The average person who does not weight lift, according to studies, can store up to 500 grams of muscle
At the top end, yeah.
At the top end.
It's usually 3 to 5, probably, depending.
Yeah, 3 to 500. But this does not apply to a 280-pound bodybuilder. A guy like Roman might be able to store, I mean, we can just look at it from his last show. He carved up on 2,500 grams of carbs, took insulin with it, because you're going to have, your body cannot cannot make up enough insulin to facilitate that sort of carbohydrate intake. And he did not spill over or store any fat from that. He had shredded glutes on stage. And people are like, well, how the hell does that happen? And it's because that he has an immense capacity to store glycogen from all of his training. And this is another thing too, like, and this is just sort of speculation on my part, where the guys that do low volume training or hit strength style training, I don't think it makes a whole lot of sense when it comes to increasing glycogen storage. You're probably better off on a higher volume style training to promote glycogen storage and to facilitate insulin. It's matching your diet to your training to be a bodybuilder. But a guy like him, who's doing higher to moderate to higher volume training, clearly demonstrated that he can store 2,500 grams of glycogen, which is crazy. And what
carbs is like, it's even more than that.
Yeah, so it's even more than that. If you think about it, people are, I had a lot of people say, how's this guy not fat on stage? That's, or whatever. It's because those carbohydrates are not being stored as fat. They're being stored as muscle glycogen.
The more muscle you have, the more energy you require to maintain that muscle, and the more you can store in that muscle.
Correct. So on a carb cycling diet, you can be in a deficit for the majority of the week. And technically, if you looked at your BMR, be in a surplus on that high carbohydrate day and store 0 fat.
You'd have to you'd have to push that surplus for days.
And this is why we keep the fats low on that day and push the carbohydrates really high, because we're trying to promote glycogen storage.
Yep. And it's why fats and carbohydrates would be inversely correlated in those cases, right? You would bring the fat. The higher the carbs, the lower the fat.
Correct. So it's essentially, it's a trick of the energy management systems of the body. So you're technically in a caloric surplus on that day, but that surplus is not being stored as body fat. It's being stored as glycogen. Now, we're not burning any fat on that day, because you have to be in a deficit to burn fat. We do know that. But that excess energy is being stored. There's no violation of thermodynamics here. It's not
stored. You're just getting stored in the right place.
It's getting stored as muscle glycogen, and then we fill ourselves back up. We have glycogen type topped off for the week. And you can get pretty aggressive with it too. So as Roman demonstrated, we talked about it before. So let's say that he is storing 2,000 grams of glycogen, and glycogen is 3 to 4 parts water on top of it. So we're talking about a guy his size. So we're talking about, two, I'm doing math here. That's 8 kilograms of stored water and glycogen. So we're talking about 18 pounds,
Yep.
16 pounds. How much better are you going to look on stage with that extra? I mean, it's like putting an air pump in your...
As a woman, but I can move mine by 11 pounds. So just
right. And I'm just using simple math here. It probably doesn't work out to be exactly that way. You're going to burn some of it off.
It's
right.
There's a thermic effect of carbohydrates. So
yeah, there is a thermic effect of carbohydrates. So, and that's another thing too with running the high carbohydrate day. And it just blows people's minds. Like they think they need to be in this caloric deficit the whole time. I've actually found that it increases metabolism, and guys will actually start to lose weight again. Like they'll sort of hit a wall, and then you throw the high carbohydrate day on a contest prep, and then your metabolism just picks right back up.
Yeah. Well, part of the conversion from T4 to T3 is glucose is required, right?
Right.
Again, in nature, we really haven't evolved much in the last 40,000 years. When our body had no carbohydrates, the body was not really looking to be putting on muscle, right? It was trying to just survive at that point. And so it would slow things down to compensate for lack of food. When you have an excess of carbohydrates, it's like a reward. So your body's going to speed things up to compensate for that.
Yeah. So we're preventing by this, not only are we storing glycogen, we're preventing downregulation of the thyroid as well. maybe even stimulating it.
Yeah. If someone's metabolism is working correctly, generally, like when I go from a low to a high day, I lose weight after the high day.
Yeah. Usually it's the day after I will be heavier because just the water that I picked up from,
after that, then it tends to drop.
But then 2 days, then I'll start dropping again. I'll drop even more again. And you'll notice too, like after that high carbohydrate day, I don't know if you have this effect either, but I'll sweat that night after I've had all those carbs. I am just a furnace. My body is a furnace.
Yeah. Well, you and I both have probably faster thyroids than most. So just speeding that up even more.
It's really a pretty amazing process to go through.
Right. And not to go on a complete tangent, but with that conversion T4 to T3, the conversion itself is also what helps growth hormone work and convert to IGF. So you're getting a lot of different effects by eating.
Yep. So you can see here where obviously we need to be in a deficit to burn fat. In the off season, it makes sense to be in a surplus because we're going to have to be in a surplus to gain. But it just makes zero sense when you unpack and understand how all these processes work. It really, you're just tying one arm behind your back when you eliminate carbohydrates from your diet. If you're trying to be a bodybuilder, if you're trying to be a strength athlete, any performance athlete that involves muscular performance, you're just literally cutting an arm off. It's just a dumb way to do things.
And there's very little direct role for dietary fat in muscle building. It doesn't play a direct.
Nope.
It has no direct function.
There's also the health aspect of it too. Like a lot of these people that I see run the high, and they'll say otherwise, but I have not seen in blood work, their lipids are completely trashed. And
then you add gear to that too, and
which already skews lipids on top of it. So we have to be very careful with fat intake when we're running PEDs.
Yep.
So there are a multitude performance reasons, health reasons. There's just a multitude of reasons why you would not want to cut your carbohydrates super low if you want to be a strength or bodybuilding athlete or for hypertrophy. It's just none of it makes any sense.
Yeah, but again, it goes back to the basics that most Americans are very confused about what they're eating, right? And they want their carbs. And if you actually look at their diet, it's generally rarely do I see someone's diet who's not eating at least 100 grams of fat.
Yeah.
And they think
fat. Yeah, people are probably getting that in a meal, Kurt. I mean, you eat a burger and fries. I mean, I don't know. I mean, there's got to be close to 100 grams of fat just in that meal.
Yeah.
I would imagine. I don't know off the top of my head. I'd have to look at the macros. It's high. It's or pizza. How much fat is in pizza? And I think that's another area where people get themselves confused too, is they think the carbohydrates are making them fat, but really, they talk about eating sweets, but
candy, most of it has fat in it too.
Yeah, and people aren't really pounding candy either. It's what I see people eating are like cookies and cakes and desserts, which
the only candy that I would use, like probably same as you, is like stuff that's pure sugar.
Pure sugar. Yeah. But that person that goes out to dinner at the Cheesecake Factory and they think the cheesecake made them fat because of the sugar, because of the sweets. There's probably more calories
grams of fat in that slice, if not
from the fat in there than there is so it's the fat sugar combo that's getting them in trouble. And we know, I mean, just logically peeling the layer of the onion back, that your body's going to prioritize glucose for fuel. So any excess, right, any excess fats that you have in that meal, what's going to happen to those?
It has to get stored. Because again, it's thermodynamics. It can't just go, it doesn't disappear.
Right, it has to get stored as fat. That is the only possible thing that's going to happen to it. Your body's going to prioritize the carbohydrates. Now, if you're eating in excess of both, I mean, you are going to store fat from the carbohydrates too. But it just makes no sense. The whole thing makes no sense. All right. Do you have any parting words for the folks on carbohydrates?
Well, we should definitely do a video on fat. I think would help next.
Yeah, I tell you, can't encourage people enough to read this book.
That is a good book.
Know Your Fats. I don't know, man. It frustrates the crap out of me how people make assessments on diets and what diet is the best for them when they literally have zero clue about how any of this stuff even works. Like they don't even understand what a carbohydrate or a fat is.
Yeah. And that's why, like, you and I are both coaches, and we both probably recommend very similar diets to people, right?
Yeah.
When you're my coach, so I know what you recommend, at least to me. So
now I will say this: if I have somebody that's severely obese, I will put them on a lower carbohydrate diet. But what I'll do, and this is what I do, this is sort of my thing, I'll get the fat off of them and I'll slowly start pushing the carbs back up. Like if I have somebody that's severely obese, and I'll get these guys, they're just shocked. They're like, I didn't think I could eat this many carbs. I thought this was impossible. But like once I get them back down to a reasonable body fat level, I'll start pushing carbs back in and get their metabolism sped back up. I've done it. I've had a lot of guys come to me too that have had, I have one client I can think of off the top of my head right now that lost 200 pounds before he came to me, but he was eating something like 1,200 calories a day. He got the fat off, but his metabolism was just completely destroyed. Yeah. And so we slowly started introducing carbohydrates back into his diet and just kept pushing him up. And I've got him up to now where he's eating, 3,500 calories a day, over 3,000. And he hasn't put on any fat. His body fat hasn't increased at all.
But the key is, like you touched on it just now, I think the key is you're going to grow better. You're going to respond better to insulin and carbohydrates if you're leaner, right? So once a man is over 15% body fat, there's some level of inflammation that's going on chronically.
Yeah, you're probably insulin resistant to a certain degree.
Cells are inflamed basically, and the cell membrane is not going to be as receptive to things like glucose. So, so the easiest way to tell is if you can't see your abs, you should probably get leaner before you try to gain weight.
Yeah. Oh man, I got people upset with that post I put up, but yeah. So there's that whole aspect too. Yeah. So if you're over 15% body fat, you probably do have some level of insulin resistance going on. Probably.
There's a large percentage of Americans are insulin resistant, whether they know it or not.
Yeah. It may not show up in your A1C, but you'll see it in your lipids. Yeah, usually when I see triglycerides start to climb, there's an issue with glucose metabolism. It's amazing to me how doctors don't know that.
Well, because they don't. So like in medical school, we're taught very little. Like you in physiology, go over the Krebs cycles, you go over energy in the human body, but they don't relate it back to food. So food is never discussed, right? And there's so much that has to be crammed into that time frame that food is not really, there's no room for it, at least as the curriculum is now.
Yeah, it's just amazing to me that they'll prescribe a medicine to lower triglycerides but not address the dietary or exercise end of it. It's just so weird to me.
Yeah, well, most doctors don't know anything about maintaining health, or that's
so clearly if triglycerides are high, something's disordered.
Yes, but their solution is generally a prescription drug.
A prescription drug, yeah. All right, any parting words for the audience, Kurt?
No, I think that was good.
All right, guys, carbs are not your enemy. They are a tool. They are a thing. They don't get your emotions wrapped up in carbs or fats. They're just things. And understanding things, if you want to not be afraid of things, people fear the things they don't understand. And that's the first step for demystifying and removing fear from things is knowledge.
And you're not redundant, right? You don't have people identify with their diet.
Yep. Diet's not a religion. It's just a thing. All right, guys. Thank you for watching. Take care.
Take care.
For coaching or consultations, head over to www.anabolicbodybuilding.com to book your spot today. I can help you with optimizing hormones, fat loss, muscle gain, physique, athletic performance, nutrition, and health. For more information, shoot me an email at bigp3rd@gmail.com.